Aanii, are you someone who is just discovering you're Indigenous, or you've known that you're Indigenous your whole life and you're only just now wanting to do something about it? Many reconnecting Indigenous peoples fear being called out or questioned when wanting to connect to their Indigenous identity. Well, let me offer you a few simple tips to help you get started on that journey. If you're meeting me for the first time, I am a full-time student at Trent University in the Indigenous Studies program. I'm in my 4th year, as well as being an educator and a content creator on social media platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. On those platforms, I create Indigenous informative-based media that covers Indigenous history, language, culture, you name it. And in today's video, I want to talk to you about some tips and tricks that I can offer you if you've either just found out that you're Indigenous, or if you've known you're Indigenous your whole life, and it's only now that you're beginning to want to do something about it. Without further ado, let's talk about establishing first that you're Indigenous. This can happen in a couple of ways. Maybe a grandparent tells you for the first time that they're actually Indigenous, and that means that you have a little bit of Indigenous ancestry in you as well. Or you've always known you're Indigenous, right? There are many people who grew up just knowing that their family's Native, but they've never truly felt called to do something about it until maybe right now. So establishing you're Indigenous is kind of the first step. You have discovered you're Indigenous and now you want to do something about it. Once you've established that you're Indigenous, in my opinion, the first step that you should be taking is something I call the research phase. The research phase is where you begin to really get to know your indigeneity, know where your Indigenous identity and your culture comes from, and this can come in a multitude of different ways. The reason I talk so much about this research phase is because down the road, you might encounter other Indigenous people who will ask you some questions. Some of these questions might be like, oh, hey, you're Indigenous. Who are your grandparents? What community do you come from? What's your clan? These are all questions that we might ask you as an Indigenous person because we want to deeply understand who it is that you are. So that's why the research phase is so important. It's important that you know where you're Indigenous to, what community you might be Indigenous to, especially what nation you're Indigenous to. So whether you're Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee, or if you're Cree, Lakota Sioux, all those sorts of things, you should know what nation you come from, and you should know what family you come from, where that family, what community they come from, whether that family in that community has a clan, you should find that out. There's all of this information that you should establish to really build a strong foundation that you can stand on when moving through the world as a proud Indigenous person. There's a couple of ways that you can begin doing that. Obviously, by talking to your family is really the first step. So if you're just finding out you're Indigenous, you likely have been told by someone in your family that you're Indigenous. And so talk to that person. But talk to that person about your history and find out what happened to your family and why that disconnection even happened in the first place. And if there's not enough information there, by finding out what nation you come from and learning about your family history, you can often tie that all the way back to the community that you come from. And if your family doesn't have the information, sometimes that community has the information about your family. Oftentimes your community might have a historian or some sort of cultural person who's actually entrusted with keeping records, church records, residential school records, birth records, and they might actually know, what family you come from. And a lot of times, many people discover what clan they're from by reaching out to their community, and their communities hold records of what families belong to different clans. And I know this can be super discouraging because sometimes this research phase has taken people sometimes years to really establish a strong indigeneity, a strong historical indigeneity of where they come from, who their family is, who their grandparents are, what clan they come from. And many reconnecting Indigenous peoples actually don't feel comfortable claiming their indigeneity or being openly Indigenous in the world until they've established that very vital information about their identity. We've all heard about pretendians, right? Pretendian this, pretendian that. This person's a pretendian, that person's a pretendian. There's a big crisis right now about who's actually Indigenous and who's not. And we could get into a big long conversation about status and non-status natives and natives who have ties to a community and natives who don't. But don't allow pretendians to discourage you from wanting to learn about your indigeneity. It just might mean that you should take extra time to really establish that information so that you can protect yourself from these people who want to see harm done by non-status natives or natives that maybe don't have as strong as a connection as others. So you've established you're Indigenous, you've gone through this research phase, maybe it took you 6 months, maybe it took you 5 years to really narrow down all of that information and build a strong base for you to stand on. So now what should you be doing with it? Well, this next step I like to call reconnecting through listening. My best advice for someone who's really ready to get into the community and begin reconnecting and learning about their Indigenous culture is to actually approach their reconnection journey through just listening. Many of the protocols in our ceremonies and in our cultural events, really the only people that are actually up and doing the work or talking and giving the teachings, these are often elders or knowledge holders that have taken a lifetime to really begin to understand these teachings. And so if you look around, almost everyone else around will just be sitting there and listening, having their hands open to receive these teachings. So that's something you can do as an Indigenous person who's reconnecting, is you can go around to all of these events, go to ceremonies and go to community events, go to powwows, and just be present and be listening. I know there's an urge to really want to rush and really want to get involved in community, but my best advice is to really just be patient, go slow, and listen. Our elders will tell you that knowledge holders and teachers don't actually begin speaking or giving these teachings until they've been given permission by elders and knowledge holders to do so. So just because you're an Indigenous person doesn't mean you have to be a medicine man or an educator or a ceremony conductor. So now that we've done all that, we can begin putting our hands on the work. But what do I mean by that? Well, you see, us as Indigenous peoples in North America on Turtle Island, we're really in a state of cultural revitalization. We're really trying to revitalize our history, our languages, our culture, our ceremonies, our songs, our dances. We're really in a big state of revitalization. And so this is a really exciting time for you, because once you've gone through all of those steps, you've established your Indigenous, you've really researched your indigeneity and found out as much as you can about your family and your communities. And then you've spent time listening and listening to elders and listening to talks and just putting yourself within community. You can begin putting your hands on the work. I'll talk about myself, for example. I really started to take my culture seriously about 5 years ago. And I knew that in order to hold myself accountable to learning my culture, I decided to go to university to study my culture. And when I went to university, I began to be surrounded by teachers and educators, scholars and elders and knowledge keepers who are all really connected into their communities. And because I chose to go to university and immerse myself in those spaces, I built connections with these people who allowed me to get into these spaces. And once I was in those spaces, I began putting my hands on the work and really putting an effort into learning my culture, learning my language, learning my ceremonial responsibilities, learning my roles as a man. So for example, at my school at Trent University, we have an outdoor traditional space that has a teepee. And when I first went to university, I chose to volunteer at that teepee space and learn the roles and responsibilities of being a firekeeper and helping to hold that space for other students. I built connections to teachers, to elders and knowledge holders who ultimately were able to take me outside of the classroom and outside of the university and into community-based spaces and into ceremonial spaces. Our elders always talk about put your hands on the work. This means if there's a powwow in your community, attend the powwow. If there's a rally in your community, attend the rally. And don't just attend, volunteer. If there's a sunrise ceremony in your community, attend it. Putting your hands on the work means showing up for community and asking, hey, what can I do to support? What can I do to help? And it's through putting yourself out there and showing that initiative that you build connections with elders and knowledge holders who help by bringing you into other places and establishing a stronger connection and building a stronger connection as a whole. Miigwech for taking the time to listen to me, and I want to leave you on this note. You are not alone in this journey. There are countless other Indigenous peoples who are discovering their Indigenous and reconnecting to their indigeneity. You are not alone on your journey. Finally, it is not your fault that you have to reconnect and begin learning your indigeneity or your Indigenous identity, culture, language, history, all this for the first time. It's not your fault that you have to do that. And always remember that you are loved, valued, and welcomed in our community at all times. Miigwech for listening.